So there's this phenomenon that I have that I'll be talking with, like we'll be with people that are familiar with type. They may not be in our profile or training program or anything like that, but they're familiar with type. We're talking to somebody or we're watching somebody online and they're basically saying, like, the person might reflect and say, I'm this type. Let's just say ENTJ. And the person might see that on a video, or they're talking to me like, you can't be an ENTJ. You don't have that domineering, commanding presence to tell people what to do. You're not the field marshal archetype of person, right? You don't command people. You don't just order people around. You're not all about the money. You're not, and I'm thinking to myself, that's not what? That's not an ENTJ. Like, that can be an ENTJ, but there's a bunch of other variances of ENTJs in the world besides that. This person is putting it down to very black and white, one note of a personality type. And you and I know, Antonia, there's so much variance for every personality. And there's reasons for this. There's source code for this. There's reasons why different personalities show up differently. Obviously, it's station of life, timeline, training, upbringing, the age the person is, all these factors. But there's also something in the actual wiring of the mind, the cognitive wiring of the mind, that's a little different based on how people express their type. We talked about this a little bit on the podcast before when we applied it to careers, but I want to jump in this today. And let's do this series of these episodes. Let's talk about each of the Jungian cognitive functions in some of the ways they can express to give some more nuance to how types show up.
Yeah. I'm glad you referenced the careers podcast, because if you've listened or watched the 16 different, basically the subtype series, we call them subtypes. Yeah. And it's based off of the work of our friend and colleague, Dr. Dario Nardi. There's a lot of information there about those subtypes. And the entire time we're talking about an analytic or a holistic version of the first two functions. So if you're new to type, by the way, we will be going a bit deeper in these 4 episodes. And we highly recommend that you head over to personalityhacker.com and look up the CAR model or cognitive functions, so that you can get some familiarity with the building blocks of type. So the building blocks of personality isn't just the 4-letter code. It sources back originally to Carl Jung's book, Psychological Types, which outlines 8 different cognitive functions in chapter 10 that all of us are using all the time. But we favor a certain, like a couple of them as our favorite way of interacting and engaging with the world. But we're all using all 8 of them all the time. So that's really, and from our point of view, that's the power of the system. So if you're brand new to type and you're just learning about Myers-Briggs, or what some people are calling 16 personalities, then we recommend that you do just a little bit of research around those cognitive functions. And we'll try to make them very accessible in this 4-part series. But that said, yeah, there is a lot of variance in those functions. And it's important to understand that we have a tendency, we all have biases, and we're usually unaware of them. And one of the biases that we have is our first 4 functions, for those of you learning the CAR model, or for those of you who are more technical, what Dr. John Beebe calls our egosyntonic functions, the first 4. Those we have a complex, multi-layered relationship to. The 4 that we aren't using egosyntonically, what he would call egodystonically, or for those of you just learning the 4 functions that are not in our CAR, it's very easy for us to oversimplify them, to see them as just something to understand in other people, to not really understand, not own them for ourselves, not recognize the influence that they have on us.
Yeah.
And John's model and Dr. John Beebe's model, he calls them the shadow functions. And we've done entire podcasts on that concept. So please feel free to go look that up. But all of the functions have, it's like a territory they occupy. It's an energy that they come with. And there is usually a lot more complexity involved in them than we will sometimes give them credit for, because we'll get just a little bit of an understanding of a function, especially one that isn't one of quote unquote ours, right? Egosyntonic CAR model. We'll get a little impression of it, and then we believe we understand it. And that will be that'll be our definition when we're typing other people. It'll be our definition when we think we're using it or when we're not. I've seen people, you talked about somebody with ENTJ preferences. I've seen people talk about extroverted sensing as the jumping out of a plane function, right?
Yeah.
And so.
Which it can be.
Which it can be, right? But that's not what it's limited to.
Yeah.
So the concept we're going to go into is it's the layer underneath the subtypes. And it's also really important information, in my opinion, for us to understand. And I think it's some of the freshest work to come out of type in a long time.
Yeah.
Now, again, it's come from our friend Dario, and he has a book coming out at the time of this recording. It will be coming out by the time we end the series. It will have already been out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting time-bound experience right now.
Go either pre-order or order your copy,
That's
depending on the timeline that you're in.
That's right.
Asynchronously from this podcast.
Exactly. And the book is going to be called, or is called, if you want to pre-order it, Decode Your Personality, 64 Brain-Based Subtypes to Go Beyond Myers-Briggs. And a part of this also brings in the work of like Dr. Victor Galenko, who is an influential voice in socionics. And then Dr. Helen Fisher's work and neurotransmitters and hormones. So there's a little bit of merging of, adjacent systems and other systems.
Well, and Dario's own work with EEG brain imaging.
Exactly.
Because that's really where, the brain imaging, he can see subtypes showing up in your brain on the scans.
Exactly.
Basically determining that.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I have heard other systems talk a little bit about an adjacent concept to this. Each of the functions, we're going to go into the flavors that they can take on. And I've heard some people call something similar like masculine and feminine energies. But I think that the way that Dario, exactly. I think the way that Dario has it set up, I think makes it very easy it's very accessible and it's very understandable, and it avoids some of the pitfalls of, talking about masculine and feminine energies and that sort of thing. And I think that it's a whole, it just really opens up a whole new appreciation for each of the 8 functions. So without further ado, I just want to do a little bit of a little bit of preamble to indicate that I feel like this, whether you're brand new or have been into type for a super long time, I think there's something here that's really beneficial for everybody.
Yeah. And if we back up one level, so we're, if you remember, so if you're into personality type and you understand cognitive functions, let's just start here in a framework of, we're talking about 4 key elements that are in all of us. We have a sensing part, which is connected to the sensory world, our senses. We have a feeling part of us, right? Connected to our feelings and emotions and others' feelings and emotions.
And our values.
Our values. We have a thinking part of us, thoughts and information and resource and things that we're thinking about. Problem solving. And then we have an intuitive part of us. And, this is our abstractions, our imaginations, our predictions and patterns. Mm-hmm. So what the Myers-Briggs system does is what the functions do is they split sensing with 2 different attitudes. So it takes sensing, the sensory world, and it splits it. It has an extroverted attitude of sensing and then an introverted attitude of sensing. So now that we get 8 cognitive functions, can you split sensing into 2, extroverted, introverted, thinking, extrovert, introvert, feeling, extrovert, introvert, intuition, extrovert, introvert. And so now we've got 8 functions and where they're pointed. We're talking about going a layer even deeper than that. So we're going to take, for example, extroverted sensing, which is the extroverted attitude of the sensing process, and we're going to give it a flavor now of either analytic or holistic. So we're talking about taking that function itself and splitting it down to 2 different variants as well. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. Like if you're following along in the, the pyramid tree of breaking these apart more and more, that's the place where we're at navigationally.
Exactly. And so you just introduced it, which is fantastic, which is that we're going to talk about the flavoring of each of the 8 functions and whether or not they have an analytic or a holistic preference. So what I find really interesting about this is that analytic or holistic preference, it actually lives, in some ways, it can live outside of the functions. It's kind of a preference of the individual, honestly.
Yeah.
It makes me think of when I first understood subtypes in the Enneagram. So in Enneagram, you have 9 different types, and then you have what are called instincts. And those are sexual, self-preservation, and social.
Yeah.
And they have qualities and characteristics distinctive to the instincts themselves. And then when you grab one of those instincts and marry it with one of the 9 types, now you have a subtype. And there's almost like an alchemical reaction that happens between those two things, those two concepts.
Yeah.
And I think there's a similar thing going on here. There's a certain energy or traits that come along with an analytic bent or preference. And there are certain traits that come along with a holistic bent or preference. And that lives over here. And then you take the 8 functions. And when you marry this energy, this analytic or holistic preference, let's just say analytic, to one of the functions, let's say extroverted intuition, there's almost like an alchemical response that happens and certain qualities and characteristics come from it, right? It's like this times this equals this. And the same thing with like a holistic marriage to extroverted intuition are going to come up with different characteristics or traits, but they're going to be similar enough, just like the subtypes in Enneagram are very similar to each other as well. So think of it as like almost like a math equation. This times this equals this. And we've done, by the way, we've done podcast episodes on Enneagram subtypes too, if you want to go check those out. So I think what would be good is to first talk about what are the characteristics and traits that come along with an analytic preference and traits that come along with a holistic preference. And then over the course of the 4 episodes, we'll marry them to the different functions and see how that sort of alters the flavoring of the function.